Good evening, everyone. Everyone out there on Zoom and everyone here in the book club rooms, if you make your way to your seats and get comfortable, we're going to be getting started in just a moment or so.
It's not coming through. Hello.
Hello.
It's been 3 years. I'm John Wendell.
I remember. You can hear it over there.
I could not hear it. So that's exactly why I came up to tell you. You're talking into the microphone and nothing's happening out.
Well, I'll check it out. Thanks.
Oh, we're already late.
We're already late. We're just about to get started. This is what happens when you have an in-person crowd and a Zoom crowd. Can you hear me back there, Elizabeth? Is that a little better? Can you hear me? Great. Yes. Okay, it's probably because I'm being loud. I don't really need the speaker as much as, the microphone maybe as much as our speaker might need it. So good evening. If you'll take your seats, we're going to get started. Thank you, everyone on Zoom for joining us. Just going to check to make sure that is all working correctly on Zoom. And it looks like it is. So we're going to get started. Again, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this co-presentation by the Book Club of California and the Bibliographical Society of America. This is an in-person and a virtual program. It is titled Lambeth Palace Library Through 5 Centuries. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening and get this show started. For those of you who might be new to the Book Club of California, the Book Club is a nonprofit member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The Book Club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We also host a year-round series of in-person and virtual lectures and events like the one this evening. And those are on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, and much, much more. So if you're interested in what we do, I invite you to join our century-long tradition by joining as a member or a supporter. You can find out more about the Book Club of California by going online to bccbooks.org. So in terms of the logistics for this evening, this webinar will include a presentation and then a question and answer session. If you have questions or comments for our presenter or about the presentation itself, you can use the chat or the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have time at the top of the hour to take questions, and we'll take those from those people here in the room and from our virtual audience on Zoom. And now, as I said earlier, today's presentation is the result of a partnership between the Book Club of California and the Bibliographical Society of America. And I'm pleased to introduce Bibliographical Society of America Council member, Andrew Nadell. Andrew will talk a little bit about the Society, and he'll introduce our speaker, and then we'll get our program started. So Andrew, you're up.
As a member of the Council of the Bibliographical Society of America, it is my personal great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Giles Mandelbrote, the librarian of the Lambeth Palace Library. This is the first of what we anticipate will be several collaborative ventures with the between the Bibliographical Society of America and the Book Club of California. We've been working together since the beginning of this year, and I want to begin tonight by thanking the Book Club of California Executive Director, Kevin Kosick, for his really yeoman efforts that made this evening possible. He has been unfailingly supportive and generous, coordinating the work of the BSA and the BCC, and helping to publicize this event among many bibliophile organizations. We've also received help from the Grolier Club, the Handbook Binders of California, the Bay Area History of Medicine Society, and the Book of Washington, the state of Washington, and other groups. We have about 45 participants here in person, and we have over 200 people joining us on Zoom. The Bibliographical Society of America was founded in 1904 and is the oldest learned society in North America devoted to the study of the book as a physical object. We publish the peer-reviewed journal, Papers of the Bibliographical Society, which is sent to members in print and available online. We support lectures like this one and bibliographical research through many fellowships and scholarships. We have a website, naturally called bibsocamer.org, with information about all our activities and which are available to everyone. The annual BSA meeting is held in New York in January during Bibliography Week, which is when many bibliographical organizations meet, and is now hybrid, in person, and virtual. BSA dues begin at $80. We welcome all book club members and others to join this international community of collectors, academics, librarians, and booksellers. Our speaker tonight embodies all of the virtues of scholar bibliophiles, bibliographers, and indeed bibliomaniacs. Giles Mandelbrote is the librarian and archivist of the Lambeth Palace Library, founded in 1610, and one of the great repositories of early English illuminated and text manuscripts and printed books. While it is the official library of the Archbishops of Canterbury and the Church of England, the library has treasures covering the whole history of Britain and Europe, dating from the 9th century. Before Giles joined Lambeth Palace in 2010, he was for 15 years the curator of English books from 1501 to 1800 at the British Library. He is a scholar of the Renaissance and Reformation in England, especially religious printing of the 16th and 17th centuries. He has written many books on early English books, including The Cambridge History of Libraries in Britain and Ireland, Volume 2, covering the years 1640 to 1850. He is on the faculty of the Institute of English Studies of the University of London and has also served on that of Gresham College, London. For many years, Giles has been one of the principal organizers of the Book Trade Conference, the annual Book Trade Conference, which is held at the Ancient Livery Company Stationers Hall, well, the hall of the Ancient Livery Company, the Stationers Company, in the city of London. He has edited the annual volumes reporting this conference for over a quarter century. When he leaves here, Giles will be participating in a National Endowment for the Humanities summer seminar at Ohio State on printing and the book during the Reformation. Giles is a member of a distinguished family. I knew Mandelbrote long before I knew Giles, because his father, Dr. Bertram Mandelbrote, who lived from 1923 to 2010, was a very famous psychiatrist who introduced social and community psychiatry principles to English hospitals. When I was a student in London and at Duke University and at the University of California, Mandelbrote was studied, Bertram Mandelbrote. Giles also has a brother, Scott, who was a Dom at Cambridge. Permit me one last observation on my friend Giles. He is a true bibliophile. If you wish to find him in London, you can go to any book fair in that city, even the least of them. And there are at least 3 different levels of book fairs in London. He is always there. In June, I went to the Bloomsbury Book Fair, and of course I saw Giles. I bought for a few pounds a very nice 18th century scholarly book for my collection on professions, which was an assessment of a 17th century satirical poem about lawyers. And who was standing next to me at the same bookseller's stall? Giles Mandelbrote. It is an honor to have him here this evening for this first Bibliographical Society lecture at the Book Club of California. Giles.
Well, thank you very much, Drew. And I must say thank you both to the Bibliographical Society of America and especially to the Book Club of California. It's a great pleasure to be here. And thank you to those who've come here this evening. And thank you also to those who are, at the moment anyway, listening online. But if you get bored, please, I won't take it personally if you switch off.
Now, what I'd like to do this evening in about 45 minutes is to tell you a little about the history of Lambeth Palace Library, but also to concentrate really on the collectors of the early books and manuscripts there, and to try to explore with you a little about the motivation for collecting and the reasons for founding libraries in this, what I'll argue is a really crucial period in the history of libraries in England in the early 17th century. Now, some people here may feel that there doesn't really need to be an explanation for collecting books, and that the motivation is either obvious or ineffable, really. But I will try my best to speculate, at least, about these 17th century collectors who I'll be speaking about. A little by way of orientation, you see in my first slide, Lambeth Palace in the foreground. It's a slide of the middle of the 17th century by Wenceslas Holler, an engraving by Holler. And that really gives you the clue in lots of ways to what Lambeth Palace is about and to what Archbishops of Canterbury are about. So Lambeth Palace sits on the south bank of the River Thames, directly opposite the palaces of Westminster and Whitehall. The large building you can see to your left here, this large building here is Westminster Abbey, towering over 17th century London, and in front of it is Westminster Hall. Lambeth Palace is here. Now, those of you who know London will know that nowadays there are bridges over the river here, both Westminster and Lambeth Bridge, but in the 17th century, and in fact, right through until the middle of the 18th century, there were no bridges over this part of the Thames. The only bridge was further round the corner off the map, which was London Bridge itself. But that wasn't an obstacle. In fact, in many ways, it was a positive thing because Lambeth Palace enabled the Archbishops of Canterbury who lived there to get across the river. It was a main road. So in the absence of bridges in 17th century London, the best way of getting about, as you can in fact see from this engraving, is by boat, and it takes you no time at all to get across. Now, Archbishops of Canterbury, as many of you may know, are the senior bishops in the English Church. So they have ecclesiastical authority, but they also have a great many other types of interests. So they have secular interests, they are landowners, they are patrons of charities, patrons of schools, and they have fingers in many pies. And for much of the Middle Ages, Archbishops of Canterbury were also called upon to be significant figures in the politics and government of England. So that was really why, and many people find this confusing, but that's why from about 1200, Archbishops of Canterbury lived at Lambeth Palace and made that their home and their headquarters, strategically placed, as I've just pointed out, for the law court, the Parliament, for the royal court. And that's why they're at Lambeth and not in Canterbury. So they travel to Canterbury frequently, they participate in services and so on, but a lot of work in Canterbury is done throughout this period by deputies. And the main place where you find the Archbishop of Canterbury throughout the Middle Ages, well, from 1200 anyway, right through to the present day, is Lambeth Palace. Now, one or two people have already asked me about the new building which we have built for the library, and I will show you on this map where it is in order to enable you to get your bearings a little later on, although I'm not going to say very much about the new building unless somebody wants to ask me later on about it. But the new building is built at the far end of the garden of Lambeth Palace. So the garden is a little smaller than it was in Holler's time, but it's still very large. And the new building is very close to where Westminster Bridge now comes over onto the south bank of the Thames. Now, I may need some help here.
Sometimes it doesn't like to advance the first time. Oh, now you're.
I'm going to be talking mainly about the library that was founded in 1610 at Lambeth, but I wanted to make the point, first of all, that in fact, archives got there first. Lambeth Palace Library today is very largely an archive in terms of its 19th and 20th century and 21st century holdings. The archives are growing much faster at the moment than the library. And the archives were there before the library as well. So here you see, in fact, the first of a long series of registers of Archbishops of Canterbury. This is the register of John Peckham, and it dates from 1279. The registers are a continuous sequence from 1279 through until the 1920s. But in fact, from about the middle of the 17th century onwards, they are supplemented in all sorts of ways by archbishops' papers, correspondence, other types of documents, and from the 1860s very significantly by the official series of the correspondence and papers of Archbishops of Canterbury. So one of the functions of the library nowadays is to be the National Record Office, really, for the Church of England, and to take the records of national and international Anglican organizations of all sorts, and to continue to take those records of the policies and meetings and decisions of the Archbishop of Canterbury. So that sequence starts in 1279, and I thought I'd just show you an example from the 1550s. This is the rather grand coat of arms topped by a cardinal's hat of Reginald Pole, who was the last Roman Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury. He died in 1558. So the archives were there, but what you may well ask was happening about the books and manuscripts that Archbishops of Canterbury and their staff might have at Lambeth. So these are educated people, these are clergy. In the Middle Ages, educated people mostly are clergy, and there were always books and manuscripts at Lambeth, but they were personal property. There wasn't any kind, in the Middle Ages, any kind of official library. So, for example, even when you get to printed books, and this is a rather lovely 1471 edition printed by Nicholas Jensen of Quintilian's work on rhetoric. This belonged to an Archbishop of Canterbury who liked puns. So below his coat of arms, you see a punning, what's called a rebus. It's a pun on his name. His name was John Morton, and here you see a tun, that's to say a barrel, with the word more written on it. So if you didn't know what his surname was, you know now. Books like this were at Lambeth during the time of the archbishops, but when the archbishop died, generally died, occasionally was pushed out or had to go somewhere else, but generally archbishops carried on until they died. When they died, the traditional pattern in the Middle Ages was, and right up actually until the foundation of the library in 1610, was that those books would go either to members of the family, and of course archbishops tended not to have families, they didn't have direct families before the Reformation because they weren't allowed to marry. And in fact, interestingly, even after the Reformation, quite a few of the early post-Reformation archbishops didn't marry, perhaps out of sympathy to the earlier traditions. So when they died, their books and manuscripts would tend to go either to family members or, very often and very common path for their libraries was to go to an Oxford or Cambridge college. Most of the archbishops had significant connections with Oxford and Cambridge. Morton, in fact, contrived to be Chancellor of both Oxford and Cambridge simultaneously, and he held those two offices while being Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor of England. So that gives you the sort of idea of the multitasking that was going on in this period, and the need to be in London for that purpose. Here is a remarkable book, actually. I put this in partly because I thought you'd like the story of it. You may be able to see across the top, there is an inscription, Thomas Cantuarien, then abbreviated. That is Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, in the middle of the 16th century, and in many ways the architect of the English Reformation. It's his copy of a remarkable book, because this is the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, written by Henry VIII, when he was in fact championing the Pope's cause against Martin Luther. So Henry VIII wasn't always on bad terms with the papacy. He started off really as being an advocate for the papacy, and the title that English monarchs still have of Defender of the Faith, which you will find still inscribed on the side of £1 coins in England, dates from the publication of this work, and it's a papal title bestowed on the king. This book was published in 1521 in London, so before all the troubles later on. And as you can see, this is the copy that belonged to Thomas Cranmer, and it followed the same sort of course as other libraries. So it was dispersed, and it got into the collections, first of all, John Lord Lumley, then of Henry Prince of Wales. It ended up via the Royal Library in the British Museum, and the British Museum rather unkindly sold it off as a duplicate in 1769. They weren't sentimental about their donors, and it went actually through a series of really quite distinguished book collecting hands until in 1938 it was bought by an American millionaire, J.P. Morgan, who decided that it might make a nice Christmas present for the Archbishop of Canterbury, given that it had originally been at Lambeth. And so in 1938, it came back to Lambeth. Now, the most important library that both came and went from Lambeth belonged to this man. This is Matthew Parker, Elizabeth I, Archbishop of Canterbury, and he was the Archbishop of Canterbury from 1559 until his death in 1575. And this gives you a clue as to his agenda for collecting books and manuscripts. This is, as you see, a very heavily annotated copy now at Lambeth of Matthew Parker's History of the British Church. And Parker's agenda was really quite an ambitious one. Parker wanted to rewrite history. After the Reformation, Parker was trying to show that actually the English Church had always been independent-minded, had always rather grated against papal authority, and he attempted to collect up as many books and manuscripts of early English provenance as he could to try to demonstrate that point. He liked nothing better than Latin manuscripts with Anglo-Saxon glosses and translations in them, comments in the margin that showed some kind of independence of mind. And all of that was really raw material for his history of the English Church. He was helped, of course, by the fact that the Reformation had released onto the market a huge number of manuscripts from the dissolved monastic libraries. So it was, if you were a collector of medieval manuscripts, it was really an extraordinary opportunity. to make the most of the chaos that had resulted from the English Reformation. And Parker took full advantage of that, and he brought together at Lambeth a wonderful collection of medieval illuminated manuscripts. And at Lambeth, he also assembled a whole circle of scholars, scribes, calligraphers, binders. He had a printing press there for a time too, who were all contributing to this grand project. And that was there for some time, but when Parker died, his collections almost all, not absolutely all, as you will already have seen, but his collections almost all went off to Cambridge, to Corpus Christi College, there where he was also master, and there they remain to this day. But there are one or two Parker manuscripts which are still at Lambeth, or which in this case at least came back to Lambeth in the 18th century. This is one of our great treasures actually in Lambeth Palace Library. It's the McDurnan Gospels. It's a tiny gospel book made in the second half of the 9th century and illuminated, as you can see, in the same insular style as the much, much larger Book of Kells. So this is a very small book. Book of Kells is a very big book, but they share this intertwined foliage and this abstract decoration. Here you can see the opening of Matthew's Gospel.
What's the size of this book?
Small. I mean, I think you would. It would be sort of duodecimo size, really. So I think there was at Lambeth after 1575, when Parker's library went off to Cambridge, I think there was a bit of a sense of loss, a sense of potential that had been there with all those scribes and scholars, and a sense that there was now something missing. And we now come to this man. This is a man called Richard Bancroft. And I should say, given that I'm in San Francisco, that the Bancroft Library derives from a completely different Bancroft called Hubert Howe Bancroft, whose books were bought by the University of California in 1905. As far as I know, there is no relation, but Richard Bancroft was also a very important founder of libraries, and in particular, he was the founder of Lambeth Palace Library. Now, Bancroft isn't a terribly sympathetic character, I'm sorry to say. His biographer in the Dictionary of National Biography refers to him as a dogged ecclesiastical bloodhound. And what was meant by that really was that Bancroft saw himself as a servant of the state. He saw exactly the connection between church and state. He saw that they were interconnected and interdependent, and that if you threatened one in the early 17th century, you threatened the stability of the other. And it's important, I think, to realize and to remember that with hindsight, we may feel that the English Reformation was firmly established under Queen Elizabeth I after the turmoil of the middle years of the 16th century, when the Protestant worship was established, then Catholic worship was brought back, and then finally one perhaps feels one floats out onto the calmer waters of Elizabeth's reign and into the 17th century. Well, it wasn't like that, and it certainly didn't seem like that to people at the time in the early 17th century. There were plenty of people around who thought that all it would take would be a change in the succession or a change of sympathies of the monarch to bring back the Catholic Church. On the continent, the Counter-Reformation was producing a huge volume of publishing. New libraries were being founded, like the Bibliotheca Ambrosiana in Milan, which was founded in 1607. And the Roman Catholic Church was really gearing up to argue its case against Protestantism across Europe. And at the same time, in England, there was another problem for Archbishops of Canterbury, because there was a whole group of people in England who thought that the Church of England, as it had been constituted, really hadn't gone quite far enough as a Protestant church. It wasn't Calvinist in all sorts of ways. It didn't have a properly democratic or quasi-democratic system of church government with elders and so on. It still had bishops. It still had or was in danger of having all sorts of aspects of ceremonial, which more extreme Puritans, more scrupulous Puritans and Protestants thought was idolatrous and far too Catholic. So the Church of England was really under pressure from two sides at once, from the Catholic Counter-Reformation and from those Protestants who in a few more years would go on to go into exile in the Netherlands and then to come across the Atlantic to New England. And there was a kind of pincer movement going on, and it didn't feel calm at all. It felt very precarious indeed. And that's why this period in the early 17th century is a period of extraordinary expansion in terms of libraries. Most famously, the Bodleian Library in Oxford, which was refounded in the 1590s by Thomas Bodley, who brought in money to repair the damage that the Reformation had done to the University Library in Oxford and set it up as a major scholarly library. But there were other libraries too that were founded for similar purposes. And that was, to a large extent, I think, Bancroft's reasons for wanting to do something at Lambeth. So when Bancroft died in 1610, he left his own books and manuscripts as a resource for his successors to use in perpetuity. He says that all my said books may remain to my successors. That is my chiefest desire. And when it came to that will, his will being interpreted by his successor, who was a man called George Abbott, it was, I suppose, codified in terms of a library which would be a monument of fame for both the church and for the king. So the king was invoked, Francis Bacon was invoked, and the two were seen as powerful protectors for the library, which had just been left to future Archbishops of Canterbury. And George Abbott, in the years immediately following 1610, did a great deal to make Bancroft's vision come to pass. But I think it's important to understand that what he's founding is something which is rather different from the Bodleian Library. He's not founding a library for use by, or explicitly for use by scholars. He's founding something which will be a resource for his own successors in office. And that's his main priority. At this time, the metaphor which is generally used for libraries is a military one. Very interestingly, the library as arsenal. And what Bancroft thought he was doing was leaving to his successors the ammunition that they would be able to use in their preaching, in their writing and publishing, in their war of words, mostly words, with both the Counter-Reformation and those Puritans who I mentioned earlier. Well, Bancroft left a library when he died of about 5,600 printed books and just short of 500 manuscripts. Now, some of those books actually had belonged to his immediate predecessor, John Whitgift, and here you see a book with Whitgift's arms stamped on it. About half the printed book library that Bancroft had at Lambeth was a sort of inheritance from Whitgift. And Whitgift really marks a sort of turning point in terms of the history of the libraries that I was describing, because his manuscripts followed the traditional course off to Trinity College, Cambridge, which was his old college, but the printed books, many of them, stayed with Bancroft, and probably Bancroft engineered this, and therefore stayed in the institution that Bancroft went on to found. And this is an example of the coat of arms of George Abbott, who I've just mentioned, who was the person who oversaw Bancroft's will and really made the library put down roots. He left about 2,600 of his own books and about 40 manuscripts to the library. So already you see the library gathering pace as the 17th century progresses. And just finally, in terms of the personal libraries of 17th century archbishops, later on in the century, in the 1670s, that nucleus of books and manuscripts was supplemented by the collection of Gilbert Sheldon, who died in the 1670s and was also Archbishop of Canterbury. And he left about 800 printed books and about 100 manuscripts. So what sort of books and manuscripts were being left? What did that library, that early library, consist of? Well, it consisted of a number of great treasures about which I can tell you remarkably little, to be honest, in terms of their provenance. We know that Archbishops of Canterbury had access to really the best sources, the best networks of agents who would scour the country looking for medieval manuscripts. And as I've said already, there was a whole political agenda to this, but I think there was also a wish to preserve something of the monastic past and of the culture of illumination that those monastic libraries represented. So this is the Lambeth Bible. It's a giant Romanesque Bible. And for the person who was asking earlier about the size of the McDurnan Gospels, this Bible is really rather heavy for one person to lift. It's a very big Bible indeed. And the latest theory about it is that it was probably a royal commission. It was probably intended for King Stephen's mausoleum at Faversham Abbey in Kent. And it did have a Kent provenance subsequently, because it ended up in one of the Canterbury monasteries, and from there was rescued by Bancroft. It's only one volume, in fact, and the other volume, interestingly, also survives, but survives having had all of these terrific full-page illuminations hacked out. So in Maidstone Museum, there is the volume which, instead of going to Richard Bancroft, went through a series of families, secular families in the 16th century in Kent, and along the way, probably later than that, actually, probably in the 18th century, along the way has lost all of its full-page illuminations.
This is from the 13th century?
No, it's 12th century. It's middle of the 12th century, 1150s. But this is from the 13th century. This is the Lambeth Apocalypse in the 1260s, made for Elizabeth, Countess of Winchester. Very interesting to have a manuscript like this made for a female patron. And it belongs to a whole genre of apocalypse manuscripts. People were understandably worried about things like the Black Death, things like the Mongol hordes, and so there was a vogue in the 13th and 14th centuries for manuscripts that depicted the end of the world according to the Book of Revelation. This too, like the Lambeth Bible, almost certainly came in through either Bancroft or George Abbott, but we don't really have any early records of the library to show clearly when and where it it arrived in the library, but it was there early on. And likewise, and in some ways perhaps even more tantalizing, is this, which is it's the Gutenberg Bible, the Bible printed by Johannes Gutenberg in Mainz in about 1455. It's a copy, one of relatively few copies printed on parchment or vellum. And the really important and striking thing about this beautiful book, apart from it being a copy of the earliest significant printed book in the West, is the decoration, because the decoration is English decoration and it's 15th century decoration. So this means that it was in England within a few years of its printing, probably ordered by a wealthy patron who wanted to have probably his favorite illuminator work on it. So it's very much a deluxe object, and it is by several centuries the earliest surviving copy of the Gutenberg Bible, which can be shown to have been in England. This one was in England in the 15th century. I think the next one, which is in Manchester at Chetham's Library, arrived there in the 17th century. It has a very good claim to being the earliest copy in England of the first printed book. But we don't know who it was made for. The binding doesn't survive. At Lambeth, it was catalogued as though it was a manuscript, which I'm sure the original printers of it would have been, I'm sure they would have been very pleased to have deceived the 19th century cataloguers at Lambeth, because of course the earliest printed books were made to look like manuscripts, because that's what books looked like.
And is it complete? Is it a great complete copy?
It's just the New Testament. So, but it's complete as the New Testament, and I think I've asked various people whether they think the New Testament was available separately, and there seemed to be a range of opinion on that. So it's part of the Bible, but it actually has part of the Old Testament and then the New Testament. And finally, in terms of these various mysteries that I'm showing you, this is a London Book of Hours printed in the 1420s. It's not a particularly distinguished Book of Hours. A lot of these being produced then, but it's of interest because of who owned it. It has been customized by King Richard III with prayers to be said on his birthday, and I think we know that it would have been in his tent at the Battle of Bosworth Field when Henry VII defeated him, because it subsequently passed into the hands of the Stanley family, the Earls of Derby, the Stanleys who famously changed sides, or in fact, well, they waited outside the battle until they saw who was winning, and then they joined that side. And as a reward for that, they were given the spoils of the battlefield. And this book passed through the Stanley family and ended up in the possession of Lady Margaret Beaufort, who was the mother of King Henry VII. So where it has a subsequent provenance from the Royal Library, I'm not quite sure, but again, it arrived early on with Bancroft and Abbott. So
I'm sorry to be so ignorant, but it's not in English.
No, it's in Latin. So it's pre-Reformation. It's a Latin devotional book with prayers for use by private individuals in their in devotions. I've shown you some high spots, and it may well be that there is an aspect to those where at least part of the motivation is one of preserving a beautiful and valuable book. But of course, that's not true of the the kind of library that I've been describing, that's supposed to be a resource for Archbishops of Canterbury to fight the good fight. And many other books are theological books from the late 16th and 17th centuries, many of them printed in the great centres of the Counter-Reformation printing, such as Antwerp or Paris or Lyon or Rome. Richard Bancroft had a terrific selection of Counter-Reformation Catholic scholarship, great editions of the Church Fathers, for example, and he was acquiring those on the principle of know your enemy. So if you're going to be able to refute Catholic scholars, if you're going to pull the rug out from under their feet, you need to have examples of the latest Catholic scholarship, and you need to have mastered that as a starting point before you go on to make your own case. But there's also a lot of controversial writing in English in Bancroft's library. And this is a remarkable book. It's a book by a Puritan called John Penry, called A Brief Discovery of the Untruths and Slanders in a Sermon Preached by Dr. Bancroft. And so keen is he to reveal Bancroft's untruths and slanders that he actually reproduces, as you can see, reproduces some of Bancroft's sermon in his own attack on it. So you can see there's a paragraph saying Dr. Bancroft says this, and then the answer comes afterwards. And this is Bancroft's copy. He himself was preparing a counterblast to this particular attack. And so you can see his, on the left-hand side, at the bottom paragraph, his indignant comments, my meaning was, etc., etc. So you've completely misunderstood what I was trying to say, and you're twisting my words, is his furious response. Well, Archbishops of Canterbury needed to know about theology, but they needed to know about a lot of other things. And this is an example of the kind of thing that Archbishops of Canterbury needed to know about. Witches and witch trials were, of course, still going on in England in the 16th and 17th centuries. People had a whole range of views on the likelihood of witches really being witches. James I was very interested in the subject and wrote about it, published a book about it, and he was more credulous, I think, more believing in the likelihood of witchcraft than Bancroft was himself. But if you were Archbishop of Canterbury, you needed to know about these things. And so there are a lot of books in the library that fall into that sort of category of books I need to know about. Another example would be the so-called Martin Marprelate tracts, which are tracts that were secretly printed on printing presses that were moved around the country in the late 16th century, putting forward an extreme Protestant view, and in fact, in particular, attacking the authority of bishops and archbishops. So it's no coincidence that Lambeth Palace Library has probably the best collection anywhere, the most complete collection of these secretly printed tracts. Bancroft was amassing evidence for the prosecution in his library. Well, Bancroft's idea about the library being a resource for the future perhaps takes its most extreme form in terms of what he did in relation to the Royal Library. As Archbishop of Canterbury, he had access to the Royal Library, which was scattered across palaces on the other side of the river in Whitehall and Westminster, and he would go backwards and forwards. And when he saw a book that he thought was important and interesting and would fit in nicely at Lambeth, he borrowed it. Well, when Bancroft died in 1610, the Royal Librarian, who's a man called Patrick Young, wrote a rather pained letter saying that he understood that Bancroft had taken charge of about 500 books from the Royal Library, and there was no sign at all of them coming back. Well, I'm pleased to say they never did go back. And one of the effects of that is that if you're looking, for example, for books owned by King Henry VIII, the best place to look now is the British Library. The British Library, which is the successor to the British Museum, which in 1757 was given the Old Royal Library by King George II. But it was only given the books that were still in the Old Royal Library in 1757. And as we've heard, several hundred books were already at Lambeth. And the second best place to find books from Henry VIII's library is in fact at Lambeth Palace Library. And this is one of them. This is a work written by Catherine of Aragon's chaplain, a man called Thomas Abel, published in 1532. And it's a work which is setting out the case for Catherine of Aragon, really, in the great controversy over the divorce of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII. So the work sets out all the reasons why Catherine of Aragon is legitimately married to Henry VIII. And this is Henry VIII's copy, in which he goes through looking for every loophole he can find in that argument. And the Latin inscription in Henry's hand on the front essentially says this book is a lot of rubbish. And inside, when it gets to the passage that's talking about whether you can be married to somebody who you're related to by blood, whether you can be married to somebody who you're related to by marriage, Henry starts to take issue with the text. And the reason for that, of course, as many of you may remember, is that Catherine of Aragon was married to Henry VIII's elder brother, who died, and he then married his brother's widow. And when it suited him later on, he decided that, in fact, he shouldn't have been allowed to do that. And that was his case before the for an annulment of the marriage. And here's just one. Oh, I should have said, yes, this one of the complaints about Bancroft's borrowing was that not only had he borrowed these books, but that he'd had them rebound with his, and in some cases had his initials stamped in gilt on the covers. And I'm pleased to say that this is one example which does indeed have RB stamped on the covers of a book which is indisputably a book that belonged to Henry VIII. And this is a beautiful little Venetian atlas, probably also intended for presentation to Henry VIII, and possibly later used, it has been suggested, in the education of the boy king, Edward VI. But there are some other curious books at Lambeth as well. As Drew said earlier on, we cover a whole range of different subjects. And if you were an eccentric Cambridge clergyman in the 1580s, you might have wanted to give a copy of this book to the Archbishop of Canterbury, or possibly to the Bishop of London. Bancroft was Bishop of London before he became Archbishop of Canterbury. This is a book about swimming by a Cambridge Don, and I put it in really because I particularly like the way the woodcuts have been organised. So you get it shows in a whole series of images different ways of swimming across a river. So if you ever want to know how to swim across the river and keeping your clothes dry, or keeping a chicken on your head while you're doing it, this is a book that will show you how to do it. So the riverbank and the people taking their clothes off and so on the bank, they stay the same, but the central image is replaceable and is used to demonstrate a whole range of swimming strokes. And the Archbishops of Canterbury were far too grand to want to swim across the Thames to Westminster or Whitehall. I can only assume that this has ended up either because Bancroft had more of a sense of humour than he is generally credited with, or because this was a book in search of a patron. And finally, and particularly interestingly on Bancroft's books, there's a little volume at Lambeth which is remarkable because it has on it the signatures of its publishers. As you can see here, this is a book actually about a rebellion in Ireland, published in 1600, printed by WW4 Thomas Hayes. And Thomas Hayes has written across the bottom, Thomas Hayes, his copy, by which it means his text rather than his copy of the book. Now, as some of you may know, bishops of London and archbishops of Canterbury were involved in the licensing of books for publication in this period. And this little volume, I think, which is the only one I've found at Lambeth like it, and really the only one I know anywhere like it, it bound up together in this volume are 6 little pamphlets, each printed in 1600, each of which, no, 4 of which are signed by the different booksellers. And I think that the reason for that is that these are the copies submitted after publication to the Bishop of London or the Archbishop of Canterbury to show that the book has been printed in the form in which it was allowed to be printed, in the form in which it had been given a license. Now, the reason you might particularly want to do that around 1600 is that this is precisely the time when there is speculation about who's going to succeed Elizabeth I. There are people being thrown into the Tower for publishing books that in some way, in any way suggest the precariousness of the succession, or suggest that there may perhaps be options in relation to succession. So it's a time of heightened tension and sensitivity, and that is why I think these booksellers are being required or being expected to show up with their books as printed. And the reason really I've been showing you this is that also in this volume is a Shakespeare quarto, second part of Henry IV, printed as you see for Andrew Wise and William Astley in 1600. And here is the signature of Andrew Wise. So this is rather remarkable Shakespeare association. I think in the Folger Library there is in fact a presentation copy from the printer Jaggard of the first folio, but to have a first edition of one of Shakespeare's works signed by the person who saw it into print is, I think, very remarkable. And I should say that this is one of a number of books that was stolen from Lambeth in the 1970s, and which we got back about 10 years ago, just after I arrived at Lambeth, actually, to my complete amazement. And one of the really interesting things about this is that the books that were stolen had been stolen using a kind of desiderata list. And not all of them, not this one in fact, but many of them had been stolen because of their connections with the New World. There'd been an exhibition about the New World at Lambeth, into which all the Archbishop's books on exploration and discovery and travel had gone. And the thief used that as the basis for selecting the books which he thought would potentially get him the most money. And the effect of that, even over just a short period of about 20 or 30 years, was that we forgot, we found we had forgotten that whole aspect of the Archbishop's Library. So if you'd asked my predecessor 25 years ago or so, were archbishops, did archbishops own works of literature? Did they own books on travel and exploration? If you'd looked in the catalogue, you wouldn't have found any of them. So a very interesting reminder that libraries have their strata, and the ways in which libraries survive and pass down through generations, even after they have arrived in institutional libraries, can really change one's whole perspective on what was what the interests of the original collector were. A word now, and I'm running short of time, but I'll hurry up. A word now about use of the library. So, as I've said, the library was really for the archbishops, their staff, succeeding archbishops of Canterbury. It wasn't it wasn't like the Bodleian Library in the sense that it was widely available, but it was available to scholars. And this is a work by, in fact, a presentation copy to Archbishop Laud of a work by John Selden on natural law. And he used the library at Lambeth in the 1630s. And that was important because in the English Civil War, Parliament confiscated the library at Lambeth. Archbishops and bishops and the monarchs were abolished after the Civil War, and Parliament saw the library as being something that was of strategic importance, and so they confiscated it. They also saw it as something that was of financial value, and John Selden argued in 1644 in the House of Commons for the library to be kept together, and in fact for it to be given to Cambridge University. And I'll just skip over that. This is the packing list for sending the library off to Cambridge in 1647. There were about 9,000 books by then. And if I tell you that Cambridge University Library at that stage had about 1,000 books and hadn't really recovered from the Reformation, you can see that they were very pleased to get the Archbishop's Library and that it dwarfed the existing academic library in Cambridge. Archbishops of Canterbury petitioned for its return in 1664 after the Restoration, and back it came. And a little while after that, this remarkable work arrived in the library. It's a copy of the works of Charles I, as you can see. But the reason that somebody has been scratching things out on the title page is that it was censored by the Portuguese Inquisition. So this book was on a ship which was captured by the Portuguese. The book was taken to Lisbon. It was censored by the Inquisition. It then got into the hands of an English clergyman called Zachary Craddock, who brought it back to London and gave it back to the Archbishops of Canterbury as a kind of curiosity. And it was as a curiosity that Samuel Pepys wanted to see it in 1700. So if you wanted to see things at Lambeth, if you were John Selden, if you were Samuel Pepys, you could get in. But it wasn't a library that had regular opening hours and rules for readers and so on. You might be interested to know that Pepys's copy of this same works of Charles I is now in the Pepys Library in Magdalen College, Cambridge. And Pepys has very carefully made notes in the margins of his copy exactly where the passages were that most offended the Portuguese Inquisition. So his fascination was with the bits that had been crossed out, because as a good Protestant, he thought that those were the bits that he really needed to know and take to heart. Now, very quickly, I wanted just to draw a comparison with another library, which is now at Lambeth. That is Sion College Library. It's a library which arrived at Lambeth in the 1990s. So it has no connection with the Archbishops of Canterbury, but it was an ecclesiastical library. It was a library created in the City of London in 1629 for very similar purposes, the same idea that if in your library you're providing ammunition for the clergy, and it was there to serve the clergy of the City of London in their preaching and writing, but it also was there to serve the wider community of the City of London. And this is a view from the 1670s showing you the library sitting above almshouses in the City of London. This is its benefactors book. So this is a library that I think any American librarian would recognize much more readily, because this is a library that depends on benefaction. And just to make the point, it actually has two benefactors books. And this one, as you can see from the chains, was kept in the very public place. So in the entrance hall to Sion College, they chained the list of the benefactors in order to encourage other people. And they also printed these rather smart book labels to reward and recognize their major benefactors. And the sort of books that were coming in, even right from the start in 1629, were quite spectacular books. It was right at the forefront of English scholarship in the middle decades of the 17th century, and scholars would move to be near Sion College. So this is the great Babylonian Talmud, printed in Venice in the 1520s and 30s by Daniel Bomberg, 20s and 30s and 40s, in fact, I should say, in 12 huge volumes. And it was already a rare book, because this is another book which the Inquisition tried to eliminate. It was already a rare book by the 17th century, but this gave you, if you were a Protestant scholar who wanted to find out about the context of the Old Testament, this gave you the Hebrew context, legal context and traditions, which you would need to know about. And the study of Hebrew, the study of Arabic were both things which scholars in 17th century England were increasingly interested in. This shows you the parishioners, about 2018, I think, parishioners of a City of London church clubbing together to produce £26, which was a huge amount in 1629, to buy this book for Sion College Library. And Sion College Library does all the things really that Lambeth Palace Library doesn't do in the 17th century. It has a printed catalogue, so it's only the second library in England to have a printed catalogue. The Bodleian does it first in 1605 and then 1620 and 1674. Sion College produces a catalogue in 1650. And what that enables, I mean, it's a bit like putting your catalogue online today. It enables scholars in other countries who can read Latin, the language of educated Europe. It enables scholars to see what you've got, and also potential benefactors to see what you haven't got, which was also part of the idea, I'm sure. Sion College also has printed rules. So these are the rules for those who want to be admitted to study in the library, and you have to promise well, the normal sorts of things. You have to be quiet, not disturb other people. You have to leave, very important. When the bell rings, you have to go home. And when you go home, you don't tangle the chains of the books that you've been consulting. And having a catalogue, having a properly organised library certainly paid off for Sion College, because by the middle of the 17th century, they were getting an international readership. This is the admissions register, which shows you, among other things, a man called Samuel Mather, who's described as coming from Harvard College in New England, paying his 2 shillings and 6pence to be admitted as a reader in Sion College Library. So when we think about libraries, we need to think why they were put together, who they were intended for, how easy they were to get into, how they were being used, whether they were being used in conjunction with other sorts of libraries, personal libraries, and so on. All of those questions. Just to finish off the story of the Lambeth Palace Library, it stayed close to the Archbishop's study. So Bancroft's will talks about his study in the cloister at Lambeth. He had a paper study full of documents. He talks about the maps that he had and the charts that he had, and he had a study full of books. And gradually, through the 18th century, the library expanded. So by 1806, you see it's actually all around 4 sides of the cloister and bursting out from the cloisters. In 1830, it moved into the banqueting hall at Lambeth. So at no point in the history of Lambeth Palace Library was there a dedicated library room. The history of the library in the old palace buildings was one of moving into buildings as they became too inconvenient, too uncomfortable for human beings, really. So when in 1830 the palace was remodeled and the Archbishops of Canterbury got a modern dining room and kitchen, they didn't need a 17th century banqueting hall anymore. And as we've seen, the library was expanding. And so that's when the library moved into the Great Hall. It continued there. Well, it continued there until 2 years ago. But in between, this happened. So in 1941, the hall was bombed. And that was really a turning point in the library's history too, because after the Second World War, when public money was used, the Pilgrim Trust in particular helped to repair the damage of the bombing and the chaos that ensued from that. That use of public money was, I think, in part the catalyst for a decision that from the 1950s onwards, the library should be repurposed, much less as the personal library of Archbishops of Canterbury, and much more as a national library for studying the history of the Church of England, and as a special collections library for books, manuscripts, and archives for the Church of England. And the final, very final aspect to this story comes about 2 years ago in 2020, when we completed the building of a new library at Lambeth. It opened last year. All the collections were moved from the historic buildings into a library which really will preserve them for the future in proper conditions, where they are protected against fire and damp and heat and all the other enemies of books. So I suppose this is the final aspect of the story I've been trying to tell this evening, because again, one asks the question, who is this library for? And the answer now in this new building, which has its own public entrance and has exhibition space, is that it's for you. It's for public visitors as well as readers who come from all over the world to consult the rare books and manuscripts and archives. And I hope that all of you, if you do come to London, will take the opportunity to come and see an exhibition at Lambeth, or perhaps come and use the reading room. And on that note, I will ask if there are any questions, and there is one already. Yeah, yes, your question.
The old building, when the books were moved out, what has been given a new purpose? So
there's a lot of work going on, as you might imagine, on the old building at the moment. The old building is being rewired. There's a lot of work to restore some of the historic spaces, and among other things, the weight of the books didn't do 15th century structures a great deal of good. So we were actually damaging the buildings a bit latterly, and it will continue to be the headquarters and home of the Archbishops of Canterbury. So they will continue to occupy it, as they have done since around 1200.
Thank you.
If we have a question, we should just repeat the question for the Zoom audience. So we can make sure
I'm sorry,
you've pretty much answered them
okay.
in a way that works, but just let's make sure we ask it again.
Yes.
In the 15th and 16th century, how did a printer determine the size of his printing? Can he have subscription beforehand?
So the question is about print runs in early printing, and how printers determined them. And you're absolutely right. That's the crucial question. I mean, that's really the question that decides whether you make money on printing a book or not. But as you also suggested, some form of sponsorship or subscription is not uncommon, and very often printers will seek to reduce the risk, as they do today, by finding somebody who will help pay the capital cost. And so many of the books, including certainly, I'm sure, something like that book on swimming that I showed, would have had, I strongly suspect, a significant authorial subsidy, because for many people who were authors in this time, the important thing is not really so much getting a wide readership, but getting the right readership to win patronage.
We have other questions here. Stephen.
just real quick, would you say it was during Elizabethan period where people started to find the medieval material after the dissolution of the monasteries?
Yeah,
People like Robert Cotton started
Yes.
seeking this sort of thing, because it didn't seem like before that there was as much interest.
well, I mean, remember that the
Repeat the question.
sorry, thank you very much. So the question is about the collecting of monastic and medieval manuscripts after the Reformation. And Robert Cotton, you're quite right, is one of the examples of that. But earlier on, I mean, Parker, Matthew Parker, as I suggested, is really the person who does it on the most ambitious scale. So it's happening, as you say, in Elizabeth's reign.
Parker's more Henry VIII.
No, Parker is Elizabeth.
Yeah,
He's
he's
he dies in 1575.
Succeeded by Abbott, correctly?
No. So Abbott succeeds Bancroft. So Abbott.
Probably then there was someone.
So there's Whitgift. Yes, there's Whitgift is before Bancroft and dies in 1604. Bancroft dies in 1610, and Abbott succeeds him.
And did James appoint, or Lady Elizabeth appoint Bancroft?
So Bancroft becomes Archbishop under James,
So he only had a short tenure.
1604 to 1610, but before that he was Bishop of London, so he had a significant, and one of the things that he had a role in, which I possibly should have mentioned, was that he was in many ways the organizer of the production of the King James Bible, the translation of the Bible, although he didn't live to see its publication.
So we have a question here from the virtual audience, and it says, what is the biggest difference in the collection in the 21st century Lambeth Palace Library from the 17th century library collection?
Well, there's a big difference in the sense that we're starting to take digital archives. I suppose the other major difference would be that we are not trying to be a significant modern theological library. So we're mostly buying, in terms of books and manuscripts, in a very limited way nowadays, but the big expansion area is archives. So the 20th century archives that come from national church institutions. So I suppose we're still documenting in various ways the aspirations and the troubles of the Church of England as we were in the 17th century. But there are big differences.
Another question here in the room? Anyone? We have, we'll end with one question, which maybe is a little personal question. It says, can you say what your personal collecting interests are?
Oh, my personal collecting
Yes,
interests
you.
are all over the place. But I like old books, and I sometimes buy them. I think that's probably all I can say about that.
Well, great. That's where we'll end since we're past the hour. So on behalf of the Book Club of California and the Bibliographical Society of America, I want to thank our speaker and thank you all for attending in person and virtually online this evening. As a reminder, more information about the Book Club of California can be found at bccbooks.org, and more information about the Bibliographical Society of America can be found at bibsoccamer.org. And I'll send these out in the email for all the virtual participants, so you don't have to write that down. It'll come out in the email to you tomorrow. But thank you everyone again for joining us in person and on Zoom. Have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Nice. Very encouraging to see you looking so interested.